Welcome, John. Happy to see you again. Thanks for accepting the invitation
Of
to come on
course.
my channel and follow up. It's been a few years since we last talked here, but I sent you a copy of my book actually before we printed it, and you very generously wrote a great blurb for it. And we just wanted to like discuss points that touch on it. And in particular, John, you had an idea sparking up from this related to things you're already currently working on to see how we could talk about pluralism,
Yep.
how someone can be committed to Christianity and yet still take the time to love, take the and still have love for other religions, other people who are on other paths, and in general, what's this relationship? So yeah, anything more you'd want to like bring up to the provocation on this topic?
No, because the provocation was from the second part of the book. The first part of the book is basically the proposal for I take it non-reductive naturalism. And with Greg Enriquez, we've been doing a lot of work towards the book on consciousness, really building out extended naturalism in a powerful way, and then even making way for strong transcendence within naturalism, and that gives you a transcendent naturalism. And I think that brings my position even closer to the position you're trying to articulate very well, by the way, in the first half. In the second half of book, and you're very generous at that point. You say, look, it, you know, people who want to live in that worldview, you said you properly respect them. It is a rich, it is viable. Within that worldview, you can cultivate wisdom and virtue. And in many ways, you take a stance that's strongly analogous to the early church fathers confronting Greek philosophy, like Clement or Origen. It's like, and Clement even says, prophecy was to the Jews and philosophy was to the Greeks, kind of thing, as a way of. But as soon as I thought that, it brought up the question. I appreciate your answer. We've discussed that answers. There's a pragmatic why be Christian. There's a sort of argument you derive from C.S. Lewis about intelligibility increase and things like that, uh, which I think also dovetails with a lot of the work I've been doing on the imaginal and ritual. And so that's a possibility also. But what came to mind is the thing that I'm really digging very deeply into right now, really deeply in preparation for my pilgrimage on the philosophical Silk Road, which is, um, I think, part of the advent of the sacred is a reconceptualization, reliving of the sacred such that a proper pluralism becomes available. And so a proper pluralism is, I would propose to you, is a golden mean between mere liberal relativism. Well, we all believe something and everybody has their own reality and all of that, which I think is a disaster epistemologically, ethically, ontologically. And then the other extreme is various forms of imperialism. Christianity should eradicate, conquer, destroy, absorb all the other religions. I'm just using Christianity because it's your religion. I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah,
picking on.
fair
I'm
enough,
not
fair
picking
enough.
on.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I'm not picking on.
yeah.
Or other views which are kind of infantilizing views. Well, they have something interesting to say, but what they have is an immature version of Christianity. And one day, hopefully it's kind of like, and I try to mean this as neutrally as possible, a bit like the attitude that Christianity has towards Judaism. Judaism was a preparation or immature, and that was fulfilled in Christianity. Well, we can do the same thing with Buddhism. Buddhism is sort of an immature thing that will be fulfilled. And I regard that as extremely problematic, and increasingly so, because I think it's very hard to not see strong parallels to your two arguments in other religions. Deep pragmatic reasons why to be a Buddhist, and deep ontological increase in intelligibility that happens when one deeply commits to a Zen life or something like that. And so that's the bridging argument. And so I'm reading a lot of people, and I'm sort of coming around so David Brown has a great book. He's a Christian on learning from other religions, and then Bracken, The Divine Matrix. Faber is not a Christian. He's from Baha'i, but he's also a Whiteheadian like Bracken, so they've got a thing going on. Anyway, there's a proposal that's coming out, which is, and this is actually from Brown, the idea that each religion foregrounds certain virtues and virtuosities and backgrounds others. So, for example, while not claiming there's no flow in Christianity, Taoism really foregrounds flow in a way that Christianity doesn't. And there's mindfulness in Christianity, but many Christians have gone to Buddhism, and this is just historically true, in order to get better training in mindfulness. And that's the kind. And if you think that mindfulness and flow are significant virtues and virtuosity that contribute profoundly to meaning in life, which I do, you can see the idea that what we have like each religion is like an aspect shift, a figure ground reversal on the other religions. Now, as we aspect shift between them, we could just get perspectival clash and get absurdism, and that's perhaps why people But there's also a possibility, which is, well, you could get something like dialogos between them. You could get an ecology of traditions, like we need an ecology of practices, and then the idea would be something like this: that aspect shift wouldn't be absurdity, it would be a reciprocal opening and a kind of love. But perhaps, notice the language I'm using, please, but this is language from Dionysius and Maximus. Perhaps the Christian has an erotic love in, in Christianity. This is a wanting to be deeply at one with, whereas they have a philiac love for Buddhism. And so I have deep friendships, but I have a monogamous relationship with Sarah.
Hmm.
And those don't, they're not in competition with each other. And and I can be loyal to both my. Now, there's sometimes when the loyalties between them come at issue, but fairly, sometimes I prioritize my friends over Sarah because they have a legitimate claim. And sometimes more often I prioritize Sarah over them. Do you see what I'm trying to do? And
Yeah.
you get this flowing kind of uh, proper pluralism that's neither imperialism or infantilization, or nor is it just sort of weak liberal relativism. It's a mutual flourishing, deep dialogos, like early Christianity did with Neoplatonism. That's the proposal I'm making.
Yeah, that's interesting to make sure I understand one aspect of it. Early towards the beginning, you said one mistake you want to avoid is seeing, let's say, the one religion you're most committed to, let's say the religion you have eros for, as like being able to ultimately, I don't know if reduce is the right word, but reduce the others into
Yep.
itself, like consider that. Because it seems like if you have clearly eros for one specific religion and philia for others, then I don't see exactly how you avoid the trouble you were thinking of, that like
Well, the
somehow the other religions could be like could,
absorbed.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, so the argument is another reduction that we should reject is the attempt to reduce other religions to my own. And one is a violent reduction. I try to just destroy them. And so the religious space is only inhabited by my religion. And we tried that, and that actually generated secularism. The religious wars in Europe actually gave birth to secularism. Um, and so,
That's a
but
good point.
yeah. And so the other kind of reduction is a kind of, like I say, an infantilization. You're just a
Hmm.
primitive, younger version of
Hmm.
me. Um, Now, philia is not think like let's try and do a proper friendship. A proper friendship is not reduction. Like I am not trying to subsume you into my identity, right? I'm not trying to say that your identity is just, an aspect of mine, or you are nothing other than a younger version of me. In fact, this is particularly dangerous with your kids when they become adults. You have to cultivate proper philia to them and realize, right? And so there's a recognition of, right, all the things that we talk about in the ontological non-reductionism. There is something radically other. There's a complex organization that has emergent properties, right, that are not the same as, right, in this particular religion. Um, it's trying to recognize. To your point, I think philia is a reciprocal opening in which there is a deep recognition and a transformative relationship to the proper ontology of the friend. The friend
Okay.
always remains other, non reducible to you, but it's another that's not alienated.
Mhm.
That's what I'm trying to get at, or absurd to you.
Okay.
Does that make
Okay.
sense? Did that make sense?
Yes, yes, I think so. When you were speaking, one way of trying to answer that came up, and I had not considered the idea of erotic love and filial love in this context, but it might work. Um, I was thinking about having faith or talking about faith as a fractal thing, the way that
Yeah.
Jonathan does. So let's say you can have faith in your soccer team, um, that like it's not realized yet, it's not something seen yet, but that you'll win this game or that you'll win like a
Okay.
tournament or a season or something. And if you have this faith, and if the other members of the team have this faith, then they're actually gonna play better. Like the faith isn't a delusion. The faith like is gonna emanate down onto
Yeah, yeah.
the members
Yeah.
of the team, and they're gonna work better, and they might actually go and win the championship. But you can have faith fractally. So you can have faith like in your like in like an individual member of the team. You can have faith in the team itself. You can have faith in the organization that's pulling together different teams too. So faith can be a fractal thing. And I think sort of the same way about faith in religious systems too. So I can have faith. Let's say when I'm speaking with you, that you're gonna bring up religions I don't know a lot of, and I have faith that this will bring new insights into
Right,
me.
right, right.
Um, but I also have faith in my own tradition in Christianity that I'm gonna learn more things about my tradition while I will also be speaking with you, and then this brings me to the
Is it possible for you that the reverse is also the case? That the person outside of your tradition can have exactly the mirror image of what you just said?
that they're gonna have faith in like my
Buddhism, for
yeah
example, and yet they can enter into good faith philia with you. Is that
yeah
possible?
I think so. But then this brings me to the question or the worry that I wonder like if it's a more complicated version of what you wanted to avoid before, or if you find it acceptable, because like if I am committed to my tradition and if you are committed to yours, it seems to me that even if we can have faith both in like the process we're engaged in together and our own tradition, like ultimately we each have faith that what we learn in the discussion is gonna fit within our own tradition. So like
Yes, but fit within is not the same thing as claiming. See, that's what I'm trying to get. I mean,
mhm.
and thank you. I'm trying to get the idea that like it can transform us, it can fit into us, without us claiming that we have thereby reduced Buddhism to Christianity or Christianity to Buddhism. It's like, well, I'm going to learn a lot from you, and you're going to actually fit into my identity if you're a good friend. Uh, right? But that doesn't mean that I think I've exhausted what and who you are. I have an ongoing stance of reciprocal opening for you. There's always going to be more. There's always going to be more, right? And vice versa.
Yes, but like if you have faith that your tradition will ultimately be able to house everything that emerges in those discussions, isn't that still
It,
a
it,
kind of
well,
like
it,
reduction or
well, no. And this is the proposal. So let's do in cognitive science, we have psychology and neuroscience talking to each other. Now, one thing we could do is each one can think you can be like a computationalist and think, well, the neuroscience is irrelevant and all that matters. And then you could be a neuroscientist and say, no, the brain is all that matters, and right, none of that other stuff matters. Or you can do reciprocal reconstruction, which is, the psychologist is going to remain a psychologist because that gives them an access to reality they can't otherwise get that they want. Um, but they're going to continually learn from the neuroscientist in a way that's going to transform their psychology. And the reverse is the case. That's what a cognitive scientist is trying to do, trying to get them into reciprocal reconstruction rather than asymmetrical reduction.
okay, so you're not trying to turn everyone into cognitive scientists necessarily. Like you're happy that people stay within their lanes to some extent.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
No, no. I mean, I do think that, and what I see is very interesting, and part of what I think is the advent of the sacred in multiple religions, people who are like the cognitive scientist in being meta religious. Not that they don't have a particular religious allegiance, but their philosophical, theological work is at the meta religious level. The number of those people is increasing, and the more and more they're talking to each other. It seems to me like a need is being addressed and calling forth a certain kind of response, very analogous to what the cognitive scientist is doing. No, I'm not proposing that. I mean, who knows? I don't. I'm not foreclosing or proposing. Syncretism is always happening in religion, and maybe syncretistic things happen, but I'm not proposing that, and I'm not foreclosing on it. I try to remain really open to how it's going to unfold, because if I try to see if I don't want to manufacture the sacred. That was my mistake an awakening from the meaning crisis and the religion that's not a religion, as if I could manufacture the sacred, which of course was a ridiculous performative contradiction because the sacred by its very nature has to take on a life of its own. It has to be autopoietic to be the sacred. The most we can do is properly prepare for it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think whenever we engage in those in interreligious dialogues where we have faith both in our own tradition and in the discussion we're engaged in, um,
Well, I just want to interrupt. That's not been the history of these. I mean,
mhm,
sort of officially. I was talking with Brett Hartley about this from No Nonsense Spirituality yesterday, and these interfaith dialogues, they take on a veneer of sort of religious tolerance, liberal tolerance, while they're often cryptically, I'm trying to convert you, right, kind of thing. And that's not what
mhm,
I'm trying to avoid that. I just
mhm.
want to say that in case people who are listening to this have familiarity with the
Yeah,
history of interfaith dialogue, which hasn't been that wonderful, actually.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it's also like it reminds me of what I tried to do in the book because I think like this explicit strategy of trying to convert people is very unsuccessful. I think maybe it wasn't as obvious to others before, but now with multiculturalism, you talk with people who don't share your religious background all the time, and it's pretty easy to see that the simple approach of trying to convert people doesn't work. Like typically, that's not really what's going to bear fruit. I think what has a much higher likelihood of success, even if your goal is to convert people, is to bring things up the way I do in the book, where I try to lay out the good reasons for making the move, but I don't give like definitive arguments for why you should absolutely do this. And even
Well,
not just for Christianity. But go ahead.
I want to point out you do two moves. One is deeply analogous to cognitive science. You use philosophy to get a lingua franca, a lingua philosophica, actually, between the secular world and Christianity. You build up. That's what the first half of the book is doing. And then you build, and like you say, you build on it not by giving like foreclosing arguments. You give arguments that are attempting to provoke insight. You're tending, I mean, I kind of want to say, and I mean this in the Dionysian sense, you're trying to provoke an eros in people, like Plato
Yeah,
is
yeah,
trying to provoke
exactly.
an eros
Yeah,
in people.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's the only sustainable way to like teach people. If you want to sometimes you can give definitive arguments against something, and some people are receptive to that. Like some things are just wrong. Like if someone really wants to be a materialist, I think I have pretty good arguments against that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
At that, I think I can be pretty definitive. But for like higher level debates that are more difficult and that also get very existential, I think like trying to force something on people is very unlikely to work. It's also less likely to bring up insights for my own self if I do it this way.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I would add that like besides the Lewis kind of argument that I try to make, as you said, in an erotic way to try to bring people to love the vision of the world that I'm proposing.
Yes,
Um,
exactly, exactly.
I
Make it
also
beautiful. Make it
yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I think that's the only thing that can really work. But I also do this even in the introduction with the zombie myth. So
Yes, yes.
that's a like not philosophical argument, not theological argument. Well, kind of theological argument, I guess, but it's more of a symbolic way of bringing the
Yeah.
point and like
Good point.
teasing people's eros again in
Yep.
that direction. Um, but like this kind of move is it's both the way that I present it to people, that I want to present my tradition to them. And it's also the way that I see it for myself. Like I have faith that if I interact with other significant systems with faith, it's ultimately not gonna destroy the eras that I have for my own tradition, and it's just gonna allow me to understand it better.
So let me add one notch onto that. It seems like at
Yep.
least we've got a bit of common ground or a significant amount of common ground between us. So I want to extend the analogy, right? Uh, so in erotic relationships, now I do mean sort of romantic relationships, we have different attachment styles. There's anxious, avoidant, disorganized, and secure. And I think what we're talking about is a kind of eros for one's own tradition that is a secure attachment style,
Hmm.
unlike an
Yeah.
anxious or avoidant or disorganized attachment style. And I'm trying to bring that to the foreground as well and say, well, what does that look like? How do we how, just like, I mean, we've got resources now to think about this because, attachment theory is not that old. And, although the Neoplatonic discussion about eros, I think is really profound. It's part of what I'm digging into right now. Um, but I wanted to add that one more thing. Like, it sounds to my ears, and I'm really trying to be complimentary here, that you're saying, well, I have sort of a secure attachment style to my
Yep.
erotic love for Christianity. And that means I can go out and explore the world in a deeply vulnerable way without being anxious or worried that I'm going to become disloyal. And I can learn a lot. I can form phileic fellowship and friendship with Buddhism or Taoism and be transformed, reciprocal reconstruction. And yet I'm confident that that's not going to turn me into or take me away from Christianity. Does that land for you?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a really bringing up attachment styles is a great idea too because it reminds me of what it's like to get to that state.
Yes.
And we can see people like it's very common, for instance, when people convert at first, you can tell that they don't have a very secure attachment because for the most part, like they'll want to be very definitive and reductionist about
Yep.
against other
Yeah.
systems. They want to like bring up like their own solidity a bit artificially by not exposing their faith to too much challenge. But
Yes.
if progressively you're able to go further and further out away from your faith and still like come back to it
Well,
stronger,
that's the child in the secure attachment
yeah,
relationship, right?
yeah, yeah.
The baby that can explore and return. That's the mark of the securely attached child, and then they go in and form secure attachment relationships. Yes, exactly, exactly. That's exactly the model.
So that's great. And does that have consequences? Because I don't know a lot about attachment theory, just a little bit from my like having
Well, it has
children, but
another. It has a weird one, which is, you know, and I'm play with me because I always worry about pushing analogies too far,
yeah, yeah.
right? But there's a consistent pattern that people with an anxious attachment style, right, who like, right, and people with an avoidant attachment style seek each other out. And I think this is kind of like what the fundamentalists and the reductive materialists, the atheists
Huh,
do.
interesting.
They need each other and they seek each other out and they have this messed up, right, psychopathological relationship to each other.
That's a good point. And do you think this has implications also for how we teach the faith? Like if the way you interact with others and you teach your own tradition is in a way where you don't look like you're safe, like you're not willing to go explore, like you're probably gonna transmit that too.
Yeah,
If
that's right.
like I think if you that's I guess that's why intuitively I want to present the faith as I do in my book like non-violently, just like
Yep,
making people attracted into like the path I'm proposing, but being honest about the beauty in the other paths that can lead there. I think like if I do this in that non-violent way and I let people attach themselves on their own accord to the faith that I'm proposing, I think it's more likely to be secure. Whereas there's lots of people who write books that are much more definitive and reductionistic of everything like that's not
yep,
under their own tradition. And I know some people who were like converted in part through this kind of work. But I also think that this is much more brittle. If you're not
Yeah.
gonna expose yourself to enough challenge, you're not gonna grow enough in your faith, and like you're susceptible to it fracturing. Or if even if it maybe you'll be able to maintain it because you have a specific personality, but likelihood that you won't be able to pass it on to your children or to people who are close to you, for example.
Well, I think that's well said, and I think it comes from a recognition that, right, this is the other part of the critique, and you this may step on your toes because you belong to the Catholic Church. It was probably step on Jonathan's toes, but I mean, speaking as a historian and cognitive scientist and to that degree a philosopher of religion.
Hmm.
um, Religions have always been engaged in syncretism. They've always transformed. So think, for example, even Christianity, right? It's the coming together of aspects of Judaism, what was new and provocative about Jesus and Greek philosophy. And then think about how that goes through this massive transformation when it encounters Islam, and then another one when it re-encounters Aristotelian science, another one when it encounters the scientific revolution. And to pretend that Christianity doesn't go through, I mean, the Reformation is born out of that. I like, and of course, and then there's the counter Reformation to the Do you see what I'm saying? It's
Hmm.
it, I think it's an impossible project to think that to try and claim that reciprocal reconstruction isn't actually the fact of the matter about when how the religions actually inform and transform each other in deep and profound ways.
Yeah, yeah. I'm very comfortable with that, by the way. I suspect Jonathan would be too. And I really like the attachment here. I'm gonna keep thinking
Okay.
about it because that's that's what I recognize in myself. Why I'm not worried to look at church history pretty honestly. I think,
Yeah.
and see that we did change a lot. But I on the other side of the spectrum, I know lots of people, especially when, let's say, they recently converted and they don't feel that secure. Like they tend to be a bit naive about the history of the church. Like people, it's very, very common these days, especially people react against all the changes going on into the culture and they want something very stable and they manufacture like by themselves or with a few other people a very like static and simplistic view of church history as something that
Yeah.
hasn't changed for 2000 years, and then they feel stable. And I don't want to criticize this too much as a starting point, but if you stay there I think you'll run into issues.
Yeah,
um
it's a point of immaturity, and you have to start immature, but you don't
yeah,
want to remain immature. I get that, and yeah, I think I think that's exactly right. Um, That's interesting because I thought, would a Christian 500 years before Aquinas could have foreseen what Christianity was going to become post Aquinas? No, I don't, right? And I assume that's still the case. Maybe there's
yeah,
somebody out there like who's going to have an impact on Christianity the way Aquinas or Maximus did. Why not? I can't see any reason why not. Um, um,
yeah,
and and what happens is there's a change and there's a deep change, but people still say, but that's still Christianity. But it's like the way I am no longer the way I was when I'm 4 years old, right? Hopefully not. Nevertheless, there's deep continuity. I think the identity of religions, there's another proposal, is more like personal identity than it is like logical identity
hmm,
or like the identity of a function or a process or something like that. I think it's much more like personal identity.
yeah, yeah. There's a nice book that I don't remember the title that David Bentler published on tradition and how the church has changed through the years. It's pretty recent. It's not his History of Christianity, it's the more recent. It came out like 2, 3 years ago, I think. And he, I think he makes the good observation that if you look at the way that the church has changed its dogmas, for instance, or added new dogmas, convened councils and these kind of things
Yeah.
as reformed, there's many changes that the church has gone through if you look at it through church history. And it's typically justified by the telos of the thing more than by looking backwards at the
Oh,
material
that's a good
facts.
argument. I'm gonna have to look up his book. I'm reading his book, two of his books, The Experience of God and um, something like "You Shall Be Gods" or something like that. I can't remember the other title.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the universalism book.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. But I think it's a really good argument because if
If
you
you could
look,
remember the title at some point, send it to me. The
yeah,
book of that book you're just mentioning.
yeah,
I'd
yeah,
like
for
to read
sure.
that
I'll
book
I'll
again.
mention it in the comments for people, and I'll
Good.
email it to you as well. But for instance, if I think a good example he gives is during the first few centuries of Christianity, where people were in big disagreements about the nature of Christ or both natures or how they fit, and this kind of stuff didn't stop. And David Bentley observes that the like conservative position in terms of looking what the majority of people seem to have been saying for a while would have placed you in camps that we now qualify as heresy.
Yes.
Um, but it's just a few people. Like I think Saint Athanasius was like, largely by himself in like defining Christ as having two natures, and the way that he justified it, and why his point won out in the end, is because he looked at the telos of Christianity, where we're supposed to unify God and creation. And if we don't have something like the two natures unified in one person, it's just not going to work. So this has to be true, regardless of what, let's say, your bishop or like the majority of priests around you are saying.
I
You
That's
have to look
really
at the
cool.
final purpose.
So there's a functional teleological explanation rather than a sort of conservative literal justification. That's really interesting. I also found out about Athanasia that he was actually a deep defender of Origen, which was really interesting to find out. He was because um, uh, uh, so he, yeah, Origin. Well, I'm doing a lot on Clement and Origin right now in preparation for talking with Bishop Maximus in Alexandria on the philosophical Silk Road. Sorry, that's just an aside, but I
Hmm.
thought, oh wow, that's really
Yeah.
cool. That's really interesting, because it sort of goes towards your point because I think Athanasio saw the functional potential in Origin. Maximus does too, by the way. Whereas the more conservative branches of the church eventually sort of declare him a heretic.
Hmm.
But there's a lot of. I'm reading a book by an Eastern Orthodox theologian on Origin, and there seems to be this no, let's bring him back. Let's stop condemning him, kind of thing happening, which is really interesting. Um,
Yeah, yeah. And to bring it back to the point of like accepting how the church changes through time, I think what I see in practice is there's a kind of hierarchy of people in the church, in my parish, let's say, who are more or less safely attached to their faith, and they will have different views of church history. Like you could say the same thing for different topics of the different aspects of the faith, let's say, but for church history, that's something that I see for sure. Like people who have been, let's say, it would be very hard to find, let's say, a priest or a seminarian who is like doing good in his vocation and doesn't have a secure attachment to his faith and is like not willing to look like at
yeah, yeah.
history honestly. Like people who don't have a safe attachment and look at this kind of stuff, they're just gonna fall away. So like there's a kind of filtering that happens, but I also think it's fine, as you said earlier about immaturity, that many people when they first come in, like you don't necessarily
Sure.
want to expose them right away to
Yeah, yeah,
like the
yeah.
more difficult aspects. It's fine that they have to go like the child coming like closer to his parent and then further away and then coming
Yeah.
back, and
You don't
like
abandon your 4-year-old in the woods. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah. I think that's good. W- well, I kind of feel like that topic we've sort of got to a nice place on. I hope it gives your viewers, uh, a bit of an introduction into what I'm sort of like I said, I'm not trying to manufacture. I'm trying to make myself. I'm trying to prepare for the philosophical Silk Road. And that was the part I wanted to talk to you. I know you have a couple things you want to talk to me, so it's your turn now to propose a topic for discussion.
Yeah, so one thing, and I think it dovetails into what we just discussed too. I mentioned the fact that in the introduction of the book, I take the zombie myth as a way to like talk mythologically about the situation we're in, about materialism, about why it's dying, about Christianity as a solution. And one special aspect of Christianity with regards to the zombie myth is that like there's a nice symbolic solution to the zombie crisis in the fact that in the Eucharist, especially, we have like I can even put it the other way around. Like people have often remarked that the zombie is already a caricature of Christian communion. There's lots of inversions that are happening.
Yeah, there's an inversion of the resurrection for sure.
Yeah, and even the fact that so during the Eucharistic liturgy, we all are thankful that God descended to us, and we're thankful for like everything that He gave us. The zombie is the opposite. The zombie is always hungry, just wants to
Yeah,
devour
yeah,
for
consume
himself.
forever. Yes, yes, yeah,
We also like in the liturgy, we're singing, we're together, we're united as a community. But the zombie caricatures this because he can't make sounds, sing, he can
yep,
just
yep,
groan.
yeah, yeah,
Like they all advance parallel to each other, but like they're not really a group like the way that people are in church.
yeah, yeah,
There's all kinds of parallel, and I go through some of them in the book. But in the fact that the zombie is eating also flesh of people around them, and the fact that this is what Jesus offers, like himself, like
yeah,
in Christianity, there's like a nice antidote, I think, to the zombie myth. It's you can imagine, and some movies like get closer or further away from this idea to solve the zombie problem. But there's an idea that like the zombie is an inverse of the Christian resurrection, but you can also find in Christianity the remedy to reinvert things again.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. I
so,
think that's a good argument. I like that argument. Um, I think it's an argument uh, because of the relationship between the zombie and the Christian myth, and you and I are using that term non-pejoratively.
mhm.
Um, I think Christianity bears, yeah, I'm going to say this. Christianity bears a special responsibility for addressing the zombie mythology that other religions don't have the resources to address. And if that's your point, I know it's not your only point, but if that's one of your points, I think that's a good point. I think, you know, Christianity should be the deep response to the zombie myth and the toxicity of the zombie myth. Um, I think um, Christianity should Christianity bears a special responsibility for dealing with dystopic myths because Christianity proposes the journey to the promised land, the heavenly city on earth, the New Jerusalem, and utopias, which inevitably become dystopias, are like parasitic on that Christian myth. They're often secularized versions of that. Although the original utopia is based on Plato's Republic, but it's vectored through Christianity, Thomas More kind of thing. Do you see what I'm saying, though? I think
Yeah.
also Christianity bears a special relationship to dealing with dystopias because what's going on in dystopia is, well, what was the kernel of what was the genuine, baby in the bathwater kernel of truth in utopia? And Christianity has to properly, in Tolkien's sense, recover that if we're going to present a cultural alternative to the zombie myth and to the dystopia mythology that dominate the airwaves right now. So I would say that.
Nice, nice. That's the point I was trying to get towards. I didn't think we'd get to it this fast, but yeah, I did see Christianity as having a special answer to our problem.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering about like two things. One is if this is what you've largely seen in practice, like people around you that you've seen go through the meaning crisis
Yeah.
successfully. Have you seen? Is this what you saw most often? Let's say a return to Christianity or something else?
Um, yes and no. I mean, it'll come out soon. I've had the great pleasure of uh, entering into what's going to be an ongoing series of dialogues with Britt Hartley from No Nonsense Spirituality. She deconstructed out of Mormonism. She sort of calls herself an atheist now, but she's a mystical sort of Sufi atheist. So she's much more a non-theist in my terminology. And a very good discussion. And I was talking to her because what she actually does for a living, it's actually a vocation for her, is she's basically a philosophical counselor and therapist for people who are experiencing the meaning crisis. And she has two groups. Uh, One group is a minority group, um, and these are basically people who are sort of from the spiritual but not religious, but have not found the sacred satisfaction that they're looking for. And she says that's one group. But the biggest group she has, and that's partially she admits, because that's who she presents herself to, are people who have deconstructed out of religion and are in a kind of violent atheism, to use your language, um, but are are seeking, well, they're seeking a deeper, and she would said it. She said it's very appropriate to say they're seeking sacredness, and so that seems to be the thing. I didn't see her saying that a large number of those people return to Christianity, but that could be selection bias because of the people that she's appealing to, people who have recently deconstructed from a religion or have deconstructed and have become unsatisfied from their deconstruction. Now, I do know there are lots of people that have gone through the new atheism and then returned, often via Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pajot, with a little help, usually a little sprinkling of John Vervaeke along the way, usually, have returned to Christianity. But to keep going back and forth, I also know people who have done that with Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and I get that in my courses all the time. Um, so I think Christianity bears a special role, and and, and I think at the civilizational levels, Christianity has to be the place where we're going to see the best response to the zombie myth and the dystopic myth. But I think at the more individual level, people tend to gravitate usually towards one of two things. One is the religion of their upbringing, for who they have moral exemplars, and that's why people become religious, not
Yeah.
because of analytic reasoning or superstitious thinking. That's all empirical crap, like empirically disconfirmed. Um, but or they do the teleological thing. They pick up on something that they think will get them to the place they're going to. So th- they'll leave. Maybe they've left a form of Christianity, and they'll go into Sufism because they really want unity. They really want integration in a profound way, or something like that. I none of the things I'm saying here are exhaustive. They're just examples.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting too. I think at the civilizational level, okay, I'm happy that you agree with me that Christianity has a special kind of place to answer the zombie crisis. I also know that the zombie myth isn't as prevalent in the culture as it was, I don't know, 6, 10 years ago, maybe. It seems to have peaked, I think. Um,
Yeah, it peaks, but it doesn't go away. And we sort of said that that would happen in the book. We sort
mhm.
of said, because it's a myth that doesn't provide any resolution or solution. It doesn't give you a resolution, like in both senses, a clear picture, and you resolved to how you're going to go forward. And it doesn't give you a solution. It just sort of says, ah. So it is ultimately an unsatisfying myth. Yeah, but people also can't put it down, and it keeps snapping back up. Like The Last of Us is a zombie
Yeah.
myth, right? And it comes back up, right? It keeps popping back up. Um, and so, but I do think the zeitgeist has shifted a little bit. And that's why I'm lumping them together to the dystopias. Dystopias are everywhere
Yeah.
right now, everywhere. And it's the same thing. It's that an aspect of Christianity, right? The promised land, the New Jerusalem, heaven on earth, right? Has has been deeply perverted. Um, and and this goes to Hartmut Rosa's notion that we've lost the sense of progress. We have growth without progress. We used to justify growth with a moral vision, a utopic vision that we were progressing towards something better. Now we justify growth in a really pathological way. We have to keep growing so we don't fall behind or lose what we have. And he talks about this as dynamic stability, and it's this kind of frenzied Red Queen running more faster and faster just to stay in place, kind of thing. And I think the dystopia picks up on that shift that we've lost us any sense of progress to this maniacal growth. We grow just so we don't lose out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's interesting. I'll have to think more about dystopias and how, let's see, mythologically, like what would Christianity say exactly to those issues? It's interesting that even in zombie mythology, like at some point the main problem becomes often of a political nature. Like the humans who remain will assemble into like groups that become very dysfunctional in one way
Yep,
or another.
yep,
Like
that's right.
tyranny is very common. So we can see even within the zombie myth a sort of shift to another problem which happens and seems to be going on in culture too. Like for instance, I think like the issues of materialistic nihilism become a little bit less prominent when the government seems to be implementing like totalitarian measures. So,
Yeah.
like I could see people shifting a little bit away when, let's say, we were on lockdowns during COVID.
Yeah, and what happens is who was I reading was talking about this, that we've shifted away. Nihilism is still a big issue, but we hover, we vacillate. That's the word I'm looking for, which means pathological oscillation. We vacillate between nihilism and irrealism, where we get this sort of like everything is surreal or not real kind of thing, which isn't the same thing. So nihilism is like um, a complete evaporation of meaning, and irrealism is there's just too many competing meanings and they don't all hang together, and we're in a cacophony, and we're bouncing between those. And then there's a third thing that's over here. This gets exhausting, and so people move to a profound existential apathy, not the Stoic virtue of apatheia. They move to apathy, and I think Christianity has something to say to all of those. I think Christianity can talk about irrealism by talking about, right, the differences between idolatry and being an icon. And I think it can address apatheia by the fact that Christianity took Stoic apatheia and transfigured it into this really powerful notion in Clement and in Maximus. Uh, and so I do think that Christianity can talk very deeply. And like I say, I think Christianity uh, uh, sort of I keep using the word. I think Christianity bears a special responsibility for addressing these things. So much so that I will say this. I'll be a little bit provocative here. Um, if Christianity doesn't address these, if it doesn't take up that responsibility, it will dramatically lose respectability and status in Western civilization. I think that's the case.
That's interesting. Could you say a little bit more about how, like, an example of how you would see this
Well,
panning out?
let's say well, let's use you. You have a project, you're proposing this, and Chris, no, we don't want to do that. No, stop that, right? And we're not gonna address that, and we're not gonna address the dystopias. Um, um, when I mean address, I mean enter into deep engagement. We're just gonna condemn. We're not going to converse,
Hmm.
right? We're going to condemn. We're not going to converse, um, and we're not going to deal with the problems of nihilism and irrealism. We're just going to say, don't do that, and we're not going to deal with the zombie. We're not going to deal with the dystopia. Um, it, like, here's how you deal with the dystopia, right? Present, don't present a utopia. Present an eschatological vision that is beautiful and plausible to people, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah.
How do you do with the irrealism? Well, say, uh, there's a way of thinking about this in terms of the way Christianity has tried to see the world as an icon, and there are many different icons, um, right? That's it. But you can see, for example, I have no hesitation in saying the kind of fundamentalist Christianity I was brought up in would merely condemn all these things, not engage in the conversation. It would condemn and not converse, and it wouldn't engage in any creative response. And
Yeah,
if it
yeah.
doesn't do that, I think it's doomed.
Yeah,
That's what
yeah.
I mean.
Yeah. I see what you mean. There's almost like natural selection also happening, I think, within the church. So
Yes.
I can see, for instance, here in my area, there's a few churches that are doing really, really well, that are growing fast, that they're the ones that are producing religious vocations and these kinds of things. But most places are just dying. So
Yep.
most churches, they might have some influx from like the churches that are doing well, but like you can see a clear, like a
Yep.
very clear picture of some communities are going to reproduce and create more communities, and many of them are just going to die out.
Yes. There is
And
a natural selection going on. I agree.
yeah. And the ones that I see growing well are the ones that can listen to their people and to their genuine concerns. So people are free to come with whatever baggage they have from outside the church to bring up all their like issues they have with the church, their arguments against the church, whatever, and to genuinely have these discussions and be willing to change also and adapt some things. Like maybe they change some of the ways in which they do the liturgy. Maybe they adapt some activities that they were around. The churches were willing to do this kind of reconstruction and still keep the through line of the tradition and keep the telos of the
Yeah,
church. They're the ones that are still growing. If there are communities that are trying to grow too fast and accommodate too much, they just die out. But
yeah,
if you have churches that are just closing down the walls, I don't think they'll survive for that long. They have I think during moments of like social crisis, they might attract more people because
yeah,
of
yeah,
people were fleeing. Um, so there was let's say an influx of people into very traditional, rigid churches during COVID. I saw that happen, but they haven't grown that much afterwards. Uh,
no, no,
so
that's right.
I think that's an interesting observation that the churches that do seem to navigate better in this environment are the ones that are like they do maintain a through line of the tradition. They just don't lose themselves outright in the culture, but they also are willing to listen to culture, listen to the people who are coming in, and make adjustments if needed.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I'm very interested in I'm interested in the edges of Christianity like this. I'm going to a conference in Poland. It's it's Barfield Young, and there's lots of Christians there, lots of non-Christians too. Uh, but Tonberg, meditations on the Tarot and Christian Hermeticism, which is really close to Christian Neoplatonism, but has more ritual in it and more iconography and more imaginal in it. Like th That's really intriguing me, and I think the Meditations on Tarot is one of the greatest books I've ever read. I think it's just cool. Um, and then I'm really interested in what happens in Russian Eastern Orthodoxy with the rise of Sophiology. I'm in this discussion around Sophia, and I'm digging deeply into that. Um, because like I said, I don't claim to know. I'm not a prophet, and I'm not claiming to be a prophet. I'm not doing that. I'm not saying there it is, behold. I'm not doing that. Um, so I'm trying to sensitize myself to the possibility space of where that coming from, what's going to be, let's use your evolutionary analogy. What's going to be the new niche and the new niche construction that's going to open up right now. That's what I'm trying to look for.
Yeah, mentioning Thunberg is interesting too because it reminds me of something similar that happened within the Catholic Church that people don't notice, I think, in the same way today, because it happened several decades ago. But Ratzinger, Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI, wrote forward very favorably towards Thunberg's book, and
Yeah,
also Ratzinger was very favorable to the resource amount theology. Like a group of thinkers were bringing back some of the Greek fathers, and Balthasar was doing a lot of work around this area,
yeah,
and
yes,
they were quite opposed in the church back
yeah,
then.
of
Like
course.
they
Yeah,
were very much seen by the like. There's many kinds of Thomism in the church. There was one kind that like some people have called it Baroque Thomism, a kind of rigid Thomism that happened during the Baroque period, and that was still very influential in the early 20th century. Those like kind of theologians and thinkers were very much opposed to people like Ratzinger and also Karl Wojtyla, who became Pope John Paul II. So back then, people like Ratzinger and Wojtyla were seen as like radical leftists by many people. And then after the Second Vatican Council happened, and many of those like new positions were allowed into the church. Some ways of teaching were changed. Some like if some dogmas were added. So number of things changed, and now people remember that period as like many people in the church do kind of the flip side of seeing Wojtyla and Ratzinger as like conservatives who are not willing to change and like adapt things enough. So you can see this fight happening, but like what what seems to be growing is precisely the line of thinkers that comes from them. So I it's like Catholic theology is a big thing. There's like 1.2
Yeah.
billion Catholics, I think, in the world.
Yeah.
Lots of theologians, and so things are very complicated. There's a great book. I think it's called just Catholic Theology by I don't remember it. She's I think an Australian theologian who paints a good picture overall of what's happening, but it's very complicated and people tend to like as we said earlier about history, people tend to simplify church history.
And narrative bias, it's a particular cognitive bias. They find a single story and they think because they found a story. This is the dark side of narrative that I keep trying to remind
Yeah,
people about. All right. Narrative bias makes people think when they found the story, they found the reality. Because we have a bias towards narrative, because narrative is so
yeah,
adaptively functional for us.
yeah,
That which makes us adaptive makes us prone to self-deception.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's interesting. Um, well, yeah, I, I'm happy with where we've got to on that point too.
Perfect. If you have more time, I would have one last point.
I do have a little bit more time. Yeah.
Perfect. It's an issue that's like been interesting to me for the past few years. One thing I saw, especially during COVID, but even since then a little bit, I think it calmed down. But with the broad shift away from materialism, I see many people who do a kind of reactionary flip to idealism.
Oh
Um,
yes, 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 yeah. And so I'm doing a deep dive into Schelling and the Romantics. And this was inspired by the work. I'm doing a course right now called Realizing the Imaginal. We're reading Matt Segal's amazing book, Crossing the Threshold. The post-Kantian philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead, philosophy. But Schelling and White, of course, is a further development. But Schelling and Schelling tends to get eclipsed by Hegel. But there's been a resurgence of like, no, we need to get back. And the thing about Schelling is, and I'm reading a book, I can't remember the author, I apologize, right now. Two excellent books on Schelling. One on Schelling and Spinoza, and another one on Schelling and mystical Platonism, especially Neoplatonism. And this is what's happening. And Schelling, like he does and I'm also doing this in a course I'm doing on William Desmond on God in the Between, um, the metacological approach to the sacred, which I think you should take a look at, by the way. Uh, but this idea that you get to this, right? You actually end up with this problem, which is a kind of dichotomy in the dangerous way. Like I've been doing a lot of work trying to pull up, deconstruct like the fact value dichotomy, the subjective objective dichotomy, the is ought, right? And the similar one, Schelling says, look, and he says, you know, our knowledge. He basically, this is simplifying a really complicated thinker, but he basically says, but wait, and he picks up on something in Kant. Like in Kant, my knowledge of the world is ideal. It's a projection onto reality, and then you get the people who like Fichte. Well, there's no thing in itself behind there, so it's just all ideal, and that's idealism. That's sorry for German idealist scholars. That was a really simplistic, but that I just want to lay out the basic move. But Schelling says, but wait, Kant and Berman makes the same thing in his Platonism and the Object of Science, but Kant has the mind knows itself in a non-ideal fashion. The mind actually directly knows itself. And Schelling says, "Oh crap, our knowledge of the ideal is not itself ideal. It's real." And so we need to somehow, right, break down the dichotomy between idealism and realism. And he proposes what he calls ideal realism. And and this is an argument that sort of dovetails between the two books. Neoplatonism comes the closest to being something that actually gets ideal realism. In Plato, it's a little bit harder because he tends like it's not clear. Well, it's never clear in Plato, and that's a good thing. But in Neoplatonism, right, you get the ideal is like you get the non-duality between the ideal and the real in a really profound way. And um, in my response from outside of what I think is that's a really good argument, which is you're doing all this from Kant, and if you don't have Kant, like then what are you doing it with Berkeley? Then you have solipsism, right? And even Kant went, no, no, not that. Or, but from the outside, it's like, look, you're just doing another reduction argument. And all the arguments that show that you can't reduce everything to matter equally work against you can't reduce everything to mind. And that's part of what Schelling is picking up on. It's like, oh crap, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So
Yeah,
that's my response to that.
yeah. There's I also think it's important to like become good at talking
I do
about this
want to
because
say one more thing though.
yeah,
Sorry for
yeah, yeah.
interrupting you.
It's fine, it's fine.
Bernardo Kastrup, I still think you're amazing, and I really respect you. We still disagree on this, and Schelling is more and more. I do think the LLMs are pretty undeniable truth for real cognitive emergence, and I think we got to pay attention to that. But that's another discussion. But I wanted to acknowledge, um, I am always in deep respect to Bernardo and always interested in to engage in reciprocal reconstruction with him. I just wanted to put that out there. I was making an argument, but I want to make a proper play. In the end, relationships are more important than ideas, and so I just wanted to preserve that and be properly careful about it. So I just thank you for allowing me to interrupt you.
It's good, it's good, it's fine. And I wanted to bring up the fact that I think it's important to get this kind of thing right, and also I want to get better at explaining it to people because when people make this shift to idealism, one thing I've seen in practice is, or yeah, I could say more, but one thing I've seen in practice is people who like give so much importance to how meaning is framed through their perception
Yes.
that they can get into kind of spirals where like they get focused on something, especially something negative. So that's one of the reasons why I think it was more prominent during COVID. But people would start like seeing negative patterns and it would affect them negatively. So then they would become like more like centered on the bad things that would happen. And it just looped.
Yep. But this is the thing. Again, simplifying Kant. Oh my gosh. Um, all critique is basic. All the critiques are pick up on the central move in Kant, which is the proposal, the Copernican revolution, that we're not going through transformation to conform to reality. The mind is projecting on and covering up reality. And you get the idea of projective covering up. Feuerbach's critique is that. Nietzsche's critique of that is that. Marx's critique is that. Freud's critique is that. Heidegger's critique is that. This is the central move. But then you make the Platonic move to saying, yes, but two things, right? One is, is it reasonable to presuppose that the world, that there is something you're projecting on? Right? Projection means there's something that the projection lands on and doesn't dissipate into nothing. You're in the Wittgenstein, you're in the grip of a picture that actually doesn't make any sense because it must have properties other than the projection in order to catch the projection. What are you doing there? And then the other one is projection is an accusation of illusion, right? Illusion is, right, the hermeneutics of suspicion. Illusion and real are comparative. I could only say that is an illusion by comparing it to something else that's real. And typically, what people are doing is they're saying, well, what I'm saying is everything is a projection except my relationship to my mind. That's not a projection. But then, of course, you have Freud come in and saying, oh, yes, it is. And then it's like, right? And so you ultimately have to, right? You have to point to a hermeneutics of beauty that, right, that, and these two points jive with each other. There has to be a reality behind, underneath that the projection upon which the projection is dependent. There has to be a more real.
Yeah, and a kind of test to think about these things I like to ask people these days is how do electrons exist? Let's see, for you. Do
Oh,
you think
yes.
electrons exist and what kind of existence do they have?
So, before I answer, I'll do the philosopher thing. I'll do a meta thing, which is part of what's going on in recent idealism. which which recent idealism is trying to move away from being identified with anti-realism. This is actually a philosophical program that's going on right now. And so the question, the question is, uh, how do electrons exist? And the answer has to, well, I'm going to give like a Neoplatonic answer, right? Um, I've been talking with Spencer Clavin about his book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, kind of thing. And the idea that uh, what we're doing is that there is a real potential, not an ideal or illusory potential, that's interacting with some thing that the mind is doing. I think it's relevance realization, and then a higher order version of that in consciousness that actualizes that potential in a particular way. I don't think that's the only way the potential can be actualized.
Yeah.
That's where I differ from some people, right? But I think there is a way in which the electrons are informed, right? As we are informed about them, we are actually, in some sense, like actualizing them into existence, which is not Kantian projection. That's the distinct difference. It's a kind of real idealism or ideal realism, which is the move to say, okay, there's something ideal happening, but we're not anti-realists. That's what the new idealists are trying to do.
That's interesting. I never heard about this idea. I tended to see electrons as being actualized by higher level entities, but typically I had maybe like atoms or molecules in mind. I hadn't thought about like higher levels too directly, but and inversely, most of the people I had seen give a place to the human mind in actualizing electrons typically only have that route, as you said.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I did find that problematic because but part of it is just my formation because I've done enough math and I like the math that I see in fundamental physics and like it seems to work too well and to be too elegant, not to be pointing at something real. Like to me, the
Of course.
electron has to
Yeah.
exist. Like I think if because I see some people, it's pretty common in Aristotelians these days that people will insist on the fact that in science we use models, but the further away we get from human experience, the less
Yeah.
likely those
And
models are
and I
being
see
totally true
I see my good friend Evan Thompson doing this in a book
in the
that I
blind spot.
highly recommend, The Blind Spot. And it's like, yes, sometimes abstraction leads to Whitehead's fallacy of misplaced concreteness, but sometimes abstraction allows you to overcome self-deception and get at the truth. And I don't think there's a single function to epistemic function to abstraction. And so, yeah, I say, yeah, I want to totally grant it that sometimes abstraction is the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Totally. But sometimes it's overcoming self-deception. And that's kind of what the abstract like and science is doing both. Uh, what's her name? Sabine Hofstadter, lost in the math. And theoretical physics is
Yeah.
like brrr, right? Because the abstraction is doing the misplaced concreteness. But that doesn't mean that's what Einstein was doing with the math,
Hmm.
right? Like, no, and she makes that distinction because no, what he's doing is he's overcoming a certain kind of self-deception with the math. No, turns out that energy and matter are non-dually, right, the same, right? Right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, very much. I again, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. There's a way in which making a distinction between types of abstraction, which is an abstract thing to do,
Yeah.
and the distinction between an idealism identified with anti-realism and an idealism that is distinct from an anti-realism. Oh, I hadn't thought about that, but it sounds like they belong together in a really important way. That's interesting. That's tasty.
And is there to my art because especially in the symbolic world community, Jonathan has made the point. There's a number of ways of doing it, but it's getting more common to see the place of human consciousness in creation. The and ultimately, like we'll say that everything is created through the incarnation. We could say more about that, but to like stay closer to what we were just discussing. I've seen some people fall into the kinds of issues that idealism faces just with that move of like seeing
Yeah.
that human consciousness has a role in actualizing the potential in the lower layers of being. I've seen people fall into bad spirals of meaning with just this, or I've seen also people who will negate the reality, I think, too strongly of physical entities. And
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
something I'm really trying to push my Christian friends on because I really want to maintain the reality of things like electrons because those models work like too well. Like I can't if
Because you want to avoid a performative contradiction. You want to avoid that you use this incredibly high standard to attribute, no, the electrons are not real because I'm using this standard of realness. But over here, I use this really low standard for the thing I like. Oh, blah, 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 blah. And it's like that. Sorry, you can tell that angers me. It's like, don't do that. You know, like be consistent in this normative standard that you're applying in your judgments of realness. Like, and this bothers me with people I see Rupert Sheldrake making this mistake on the opposite side. He makes very, very good criticisms of traditional science, and he's using these really stringent, rigorous standards. And then on his own work, he lowers.
oh
Other people have made this
yeah.
criticism. He lowers the standard tremendously, and it's like, no, your work also doesn't pass. Your theories also don't pass the threshold that you've set, right? Yeah, that bothers me. It bothers me when it's like, yeah, um, if you don't think electrons are real, you're going to have a hard time convincing me that you're
Yeah.
in an inconsistent way holding that your child is real. Like, because like what? How do you know that? Whoa, like yeah, exactly. And so that. Sorry, I shouldn't be so dismissive. I try to be very respectful, but that I I I find that I find there's a version of epistemic hypocrisy. Jesus rages against
Yeah.
hypocrisy. There's a
Yeah.
reason for it. Performative contradictions, to my mind, are worse than propositional contradictions, and that really bothers me.
Yeah. And
And I try to I did it earlier today in our discussion.
mhm.
I try to call out my own performative contradictions,
Yeah.
and if people spot them in me, like you. I mean, I won't be happy, but I welcome you giving them to me, like saying, "Hey, John, there's a performative contradiction here."
I'm happy also about the point of like seeing the process of science, especially in physics, as mainly like the path of overcoming self-deception. Because
Yes.
if you're not gonna like respect this path for physics and value this process of overcoming self-deception, because yeah, you're right. Like you're just like making hypotheses and
That's right.
trying to what was the word like disprove them and like ultimately you can get at something solid if you do this, but if you're not going to respect this in physics, how are you going to apply this in your own life? Like are you going to be willing
Well,
to
let's let's turn that into a more argued uh, provocation.
Mhm.
Give me a more encompassing, rigorous account of systematically and systemic overcoming self-deception that you can convince me should be preferred and should exclude what's happening in science. Go do it. That's the responsibility of some, well, science, blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, fair enough. What is the alternative to overcoming self-deception that you are proposing? Like, and it does two things. I want to be clear. It overcomes self-deception and it affords rigorous distributed cognition and collective intelligence. Those are powerful, powerful things. Are they perfect? No, there is no perfect practice. There's no panacea practice. But if you're going to diss them, you have to come up with something that's better at doing those two things than science is with respect to determining the causal structure of the world. Go, show me what it is. And until you can't do that, I don't think you're honestly showing up in good faith. I honestly don't think you're showing up in good faith because you're showing up with epistemic hypocrisy.
Yeah, and another thing I would add on this point of the reality of physical entities is I think sometimes it can go together or be a sign of lack of love for the world. And I
Yeah.
think that's something I can appeal to in the Christian context. Like we should be willing to love the world so much that we sacrifice ourselves to it. So down to electrons, I think like we should be loving everything that's lower than us, and
Well,
part of it is
Dionysius
granting
talks
it
about that,
reality.
right?
Yeah.
The agape down, the philia across, and the eros up. We should be exercising all three loves all the time. That sort of dovetails with our previous argument. Yeah, I mean, I was talking with, I think it was it yeah, with Jonathan and Jordan Hall, I was saying, in your own in the Christian myth, and again, I don't use the word myth pejoratively, right? God pronounces the world good, and we know that that has to be a non-epistemic. non-aesthetic, non-moral good. Because there's just like when God saw the light and said it was good. Like like there's an ontological goodness that is more primordial. And I think you're right. It's properly known in the sense of a knowing that realizes in love. And of course, this again, a proper responsibility of Christianity. Part of nihilism and irrealism is an inability to love the world, to love it ontologically, to love it in a way that's deeper than just because it's pretty, or because there's moral exemplars in the world, or those things are all important, but they're, to my mind, they're not the central message of Genesis. Genesis is the message, look, right? This is just good. It's good that it is in this way. And I think, I mean, and to be fair to you, the history of science shows that for the, like, especially up until sort of post Newton, that love, like God's love for the world, is motivating science in a real way. Um,
Yeah,
so
yeah. That's something I'm trying to help bring back.
yeah, I know you are. I'm glad
And
you are.
and I think because I think that the vision that Dionysius lays out is so compelling, and it's amazing that he wrote this fourth, fifth century. I'm not sure. It's been a very very long time in the Christian
Yeah,
tradition.
I've heard sort of fifth century. He's after Proclus
Mhm.
because he's clearly, I mean, he sort of lifts pieces of
Yeah,
Proclus in. That doesn't mean he's just a cryptic. It doesn't mean he's a, like, I think Dionysus is an actual syncretizer. I think he's not, like, some people accuse him of smuggling Neoplatonism into Christianity. He's not really a Christian. I think that's ridiculous. I think he's genuinely doing a synergy
yeah,
between the two, and something powerful. But
yeah.
I don't, yeah, I know he's after Proclus. I can't remember, but he's close to it in time. Yeah.
And he had a massive influence on the church. I think I think I fully agree with you that I think it's amazing what he said that he had a like let's say secure enough attachment to Christianity that he was able to take very very deep insights from Platonism and then add something to it at the move of love that like I think it's just too attractive in the end. I think what he proposed is too attractive to like not accept pretty much. Um,
Yeah, he loves Neoplatonism,
yeah,
Dionysus. It's like he loves it in the way we were talking about here. He deeply does. And Aquinas cites Dionysus more than he cites Aristotle. Sebastian Morello has made this, and all the people are saying Aquinas is much more of a Neoplatonist than an Aristotelian. Um, and yeah, he cites Dionysus more than he cites Aristotle.
yeah, and it seems that there was a kind of split that happened historically with as you said, the scientific revolution was in part motivated by Christians really loving the world and wanting to understand it better.
Yeah,
And then on the other side, I think you can see the Baroque Thomism branch I mentioned earlier, people who insisted more on, let's say, just God and the world, and who tended not to grant as much reality to creation.
yeah,
And this sort of diverged. And then you have people like Balthasar and Ratzinger who are kind of trying to bring back Dionysius. And anyway, just to say that this is something I'm trying to bring back because I think Dionysius's vision is very, very attractive. I think you can have all the glories of science and the good sides of materialism with still keeping the relationship between God and the world. You can grant realities to all of those layers of reality. And I think my bet with the book is that it's just like too attractive uh, on its own for me to want to like do some kind of reductionistic argument for it. I think I can just lay out the case clearly that it's a beautiful path and it should be attractive enough on its own.
I think that's right. Well, I mean, obviously, I thought it right. I wrote you, I thought, a very glowing
Yeah,
blurb for your book.
thank you.
Um, well, it was deserved. Yeah, I think the best, when people ask me for an introduction to Neoplatonism, I refer them to Eric Pearl's book, Theophany, which is all about Dionysus, even though he's not a Christian. Um, uh, I think that is the single best standalone introduction. It's not an easy read,
Mhm.
but Pearl is
Yeah,
titanically brilliant. But it
yeah.
is the best introduction to Neoplatonism that I've ever read.
All right. On that note, we've been going almost an hour and a half. I think it's a good place to bring it to a
Yeah.
close. Maybe to finish, you can wrap up by telling people what to look forward to in your own work. I know you're working a lot on a lot of things, so please.
There's a lot of stuff happening. I'm doing the Audible. Also, yeah, Awakening for the Meaning Crisis is out as a book. Yay! And I'm currently I'm giving voice to the Audible version of it. That so if you prefer audiobooks, there's one coming. Um, I've been doing a lot of work, and you can see it in some of the videos, and moving towards a video essay and then a proper academic paper, deep critique of the meaning in life construct and why it's really inadequate to addressing the kind of meaning that we're talking about in the meaning crisis. Um, doing there's going to be a conference in this month with Greg Enriquez and I on the work we're doing towards our book. So that look forward to that book, Greg Enriquez and John Vervaeke on consciousness, and picking up a lot of like on a lot of themes we were talking about here. And then the big thing, which won't come out this year, although I'm going to be working on it, which is the Philosophical Silk Road. It's coming, and it's going to be it's probably going to be not the final thing I do. I want to do a thing on Baha'i and American transcendentalism, sort of two new emergent
Hmm,
pluralistic orientations towards the sacred, one in America and one in Persia, and almost at the same time, and
hmm.
like what's going on there. I want to do that, but the Philosophical Silk Road is going to be I think, my magnus opus, and so that's coming. Just started a course on Halkyn Academy on God in the Between, the philosophy of William Desmond, which I think is very resonant. And just finishing up, of course, on my own channel, The Lectern, on realizing the imaginal, the cognitive science of the imagination. So that's what's happening with me right now.
Perfect. Very busy. I'll be looking forward to it. And thanks again for coming on, John.
Thanks, JP. Let's not leave it so long before we talk again.
Yeah, you're right.